The hospital ward wars, gang recruiting inside Rikers Infirmary, the politics of healing behind bars. The infirmary of Rikers Island smells not of bleach, but of sweat and fear. The walls hum with an undertone, a mix of fluorescent buzz, restrained breath, and the echo of metal on tile. In one bed, a young man feigns pain from a wound that's already healed. In the next, another patient receives whispered instructions from a visitor wearing a guard's uniform. At the far end of the ward, two men exchange glances as an orderly rolls by, a silent trade, part medical routine, part ritual communication. To the untrained eye, this is recovery. To those who know Rikers, this is recruitment. The hospital wing, supposed to be a neutral zone, a place of healing, has become a marketplace of allegiance. Inside this fragile détente between care and coercion, gangs reassert hierarchy through a language older than medicine, the politics of pain. Fade to black. A low voiceover. In a place where violence breeds faster than recovery, even the act of healing becomes a weapon. Introduction and thesis, 1:30 to 3 o'clock. Across Rikers Island sprawl, 10 jail complexes housing thousands of detainees, few spaces claim neutrality. The yard belongs to the Bloods. The dorms to the Trinitarios or Crips. The mess hall to whoever can enforce respect that week. Only one place was meant to remain outside the code. The North Infirmary Command, known simply as the NIC. It was supposed to be where bodies mended, not where wars were plotted. But anthropology teaches us a hard truth. Wherever human beings gather under coercion, hierarchies regenerate. In environments where pain defines identity, the infirmary becomes both sanctuary and stage. This documentary investigates how Rikers Hospital ward, designed for convalescence, mutated into an informal diplomatic hub between rival gangs, how medical personnel, correction officers, and inmates navigated an unspoken economy of power, and how care itself became a camouflage for control. Thesis. The Rikers Infirmary is not an exception to the island's violence, it is its mirror. In a system where power is currency, the body becomes collateral. The architecture of mercy and control. When the North Infirmary Command opened in the early 1980s, it was heralded as a step toward humanization. Rikers had already earned notoriety for overcrowding and brutality, and the NIC was framed as reform, a facility where detainees could heal under professional medical oversight, separated from the chaos of general population. Each ward housed roughly 60 beds, divided by function: trauma recovery, chronic illness, psychiatric stabilization. In theory, security and care operated in tandem. But even in its blueprints, the paradox was visible. Half the space was medical, the other half, security infrastructure. Locked doors, surveillance booths, reinforced glass. It was never a hospital. It was a hybrid organism, a place where the logic of punishment fused with that of care. By the 1990s, Rikers had evolved into a microstate of tribes. Each gang operated as a governing structure. The Bloods with their hierarchy of sets, the Latin Kings with ritualistic loyalty codes, the Trinitarios with discipline imported from Dominican street culture. To survive, inmates aligned. To resist alignment was to invite predation. The infirmary, meant to neutralize these hierarchies, instead became their extension. An anthropologist studying prison culture might describe it as a process of cultural infection. Wherever social life exists, even under surveillance, informal systems of meaning, territory, exchange, initiation, reassert themselves. The NIC, by isolating bodies but not social instinct, became a controlled petri dish for hierarchy. Inside Rikers, pain has value. It is proof of experience, a mark of initiation, a story told through scar tissue. For gang leaders, the infirmary offered a perfect recruitment ground. Inmates weakened, disoriented, or afraid after assaults. Medical staff too overworked to monitor subtle coercion. Security diluted by the ethics of medical privacy. The script was simple. A wounded detainee is transferred to the ward. He's visited by members of his housing unit's dominant set, ostensibly to check on his recovery. They bring contraband, favors, or food, small comforts that establish a bond of obligation. Then come the words, "We looked out for you." When you get back upstairs, you know what that means. Pain becomes initiation. Healing becomes recruitment. Every ward needs cleaning. At Rikers, the inmates themselves do it. The position of orderly, an inmate worker assigned to sweep, deliver food, or assist nurses, is both privilege and power. In the 2000s, as staffing shortages worsened, orderlies effectively ran the daily operations of the NIC. They controlled food portions, laundry access, even communication between cells. More importantly, They served as intermediaries between the medical staff and the gangs. A doctor might think he's asking for a blanket to be delivered. An orderly decides who receives it. Over time, that discretion becomes influence, an informal bureaucracy of mercy. Anthropologically, this is classic middleman power. The one who controls favors controls allegiance. Many orderlies were gang-affiliated. Some were appointed by gang leadership precisely for this leverage. Thus the infirmary became an administrative annex of the yard, soft power hidden beneath latex gloves. Correction officers assigned to the infirmary face a paradox. They must enforce discipline in a space designed for empathy. To intervene too harshly risks violating medical protocols. To be lenient invites manipulation. Many COs describe the ward as a trap in slow motion. They rotate through 12-hour shifts where every kindness can be leveraged. A request for extra gauze, a whispered conversation, a smile, all can signify alliance or betrayal. By the mid-2010s, disciplinary reports show spikes in contraband movement originating from medical units, cell phones, Suboxone strips, and smuggled letters. The NIC became both a checkpoint and a loophole. Anthropologist Michel Foucault once wrote that, "The hospital is a space of visibility, the patient exposed to knowledge." At Rikers, visibility is inverted. Behind the curtain of care, power operates unseen. Doctors prescribe, nurses document, but beneath the paper trail runs a parallel economy. Medications traded for protection, medical supplies used as smuggling vessels, hospital transfers exploited to move personnel across rival territories. Even the language of medicine becomes coded. He's got inflammation means he's in trouble. Needs observation means keep him isolated. The medical chart transforms into a ledger of politics. By 2016, Rikers' gang landscape had splintered. Traditional sets, Bloods, Crips, Latin Kings, were rivaled by hybrids like Macbala and Patria. These groups operated less through ideology than logistics. Smuggling routes, commissary control, and medical access. The infirmary became their neutral zone. Violence there risked administrative shutdown. Diplomacy there meant extended influence. Recruiters began treating the ward like an embassy. Injured members of smaller cliques could be approached without open confrontation. A new recruit might emerge not from the yard but from a hospital bed, indoctrinated through acts of care. This is the anthropology of coercive kinship, violence wrapped in compassion. The Department of Correction officially classifies the NIC as a medical and security hybrid facility. But oversight documents from the late 2010s show minimal gang intelligence presence. Why? Because the hospital wing was considered low risk. Administrative focus centered on intake, housing, and recreation yards, sites of overt violence. The NIC's quietness read as success. No riots, no stabbings, no lockdowns. But that quiet masked recruitment, strategy meetings, and the slow reorganization of power networks. Silence, as always in Rikers, is not peace, it's incubation. When Correctional Health Services, CHS, took over medical operations in 2015, they inherited a system of ethical tension. Physicians were bound by confidentiality laws, COs by security protocols. The result was a jurisdictional void, a gap gangs could exploit. Doctors couldn't report suspicious exchanges without breaching privacy. Officers couldn't interfere without breaching care. Between these two silences grew the invisible institution of recruitment. In anthropology, such a space is called a liminal zone, a threshold between roles where normal rules dissolve. At Rikers, that liminality has become permanent. Walk through the ward today and you see a condensed version of the entire jail. The hierarchy of allegiance, mapped in bed placement. The trade economy negotiated through favors. The language of threat coded in kindness. Each saline bag, each clipboard, each visit is a gesture within a larger system of survival. To study the Rikers Infirmary is to study the psychology of captivity itself, how the human drive for belonging mutates under pressure until even care becomes a form of control. Late one night, a nurse at the NIC notices a folded note under a food tray. It's not a medical complaint but a list of names, housing units, dates, and what appear to be initials of sets. Within a week, one of those names turns up assaulted in another unit. The incident is logged as inmate-on-inmate violence. No mention is made of the infirmary. But among those who know the island's anatomy, the message is clear. The hospital ward isn't a refuge. It's a control room, soft light replacing steel bars, but the same machinery beneath. Inside Rikers' North Infirmary Command, vulnerability is the only universal currency. A man in pain is temporarily stripped of his primary defense, aggression. The bruised, the stitched, the sedated, they exist in an emotional no man's land between predator and prey. It is precisely in this interval that social reprogramming occurs. Anthropologists studying confinement environments describe this as a threshold moment, a period where old identities are suspended and new affiliations can be inscribed. In tribal cultures, such moments accompany initiation. In prisons, they accompany convalescence. A man who arrives at the infirmary after a stabbing or assault does not just enter a medical ward. He enters a cultural crossroads. He is isolated from his previous housing unit and temporarily detached from his existing social hierarchy. This dislocation, though intended for healing, provides the exact psychological conditions needed for recruitment. The gangs that dominate Rikers understand this intuitively. Pain makes pliable clay. The mechanism of recruitment inside the infirmary operates less like a conspiracy and more like an ecosystem. There are roles, territories, and rituals, each camouflaged within legitimate medical processes. Phase 1. Contact. The initial point of contact often occurs not through speech but through service. A gang-affiliated orderly might bring the patient a meal tray faster than others, or offer an extra blanket by mistake. It's an act small enough to seem benign but meaningful enough to be remembered. The gesture opens the door. Phase 2. Association. The orderly later returns, this time with advice. Which COs are strict, which are lenient, which nights are safest to sleep. This insider knowledge signals belonging. The patient begins to perceive the giver not as a manipulator but as an ally. Phase 3. Reciprocity. Soon, small debts accumulate. A phone call facilitated. A message relayed. A medical request expedited through connections. The patient becomes indebted, emotionally, sometimes materially. When he's well enough to return to general population, the final request arrives quietly. You remember who looked out for you, right? The transition from care to allegiance is invisible, because it feels like gratitude. The inmate orderlies form a distinct class within the infirmary. They are both servants and gatekeepers. Their authority is informal yet absolute. They decide who gets water first, who receives assistance to shower, who gets moved closer to the nurse's station, where staff supervision means safety. In interviews conducted by correctional researchers, several former inmates describe these orderlies as the ward bosses. To medical staff they appear helpful. To patients they are envoys of control. A sociological study from 2019 by the Vera Institute of Justice noted that in environments where staff turnover is high, inmate workers often recreate social hierarchies based on outside identities. At Rikers, those hierarchies correspond almost exactly to gang structure. The orderlies mirror the street world they left behind, lieutenants under captains, runners under lieutenants. Every mop stroke, every meal tray, every whispered exchange becomes a transaction in a larger bureaucracy of influence. Contraband enters Rikers through multiple vectors: staff corruption, visitor smuggling, supply delivery. But the infirmary offers a special advantage. Medical materials are less scrutinized. Packages labeled sterile supplies pass more freely through checkpoints. Inside them, Suboxone strips or small phones can be embedded between gauze layers or within sealed bandages. Once inside, the medical chain disguises distribution. A syringe cap here, a pill there, tiny exchanges masked by routine. To the untrained observer, it's logistics. To those fluent in the ward subculture, it's commerce. Every ward has what inmates call a connect, someone who can broker these items through the hospital network. And every connect needs protection. Protection requires soldiers. Thus, recruitment becomes necessity, not ideology. Most nurses and doctors who work at Rikers do so under immense pressure. Many are contract workers, short-term hires from public hospitals, unaware of the deep subcultural layers surrounding their patients. The medical staff rarely recognize recruitment in real time because it doesn't look like coercion. It looks like conversation. It looks like empathy. A patient who requests to see another in the next ward under the pretense of emotional support might be transmitting information. A nurse who allows it, believing she's fostering rehabilitation, unknowingly enables communication between rival gangs. Over time, staff develop selective blindness, a psychological adaptation similar to trauma detachment. They learn what not to see. Anthropologically, this detachment serves as emotional armor but functions systemically as complicity. Correction officers stationed in the infirmary occupy an unenviable position. They are expected to enforce discipline without violating medical ethics. In practice, that means they often witness manipulations they cannot act upon. Some officers rationalize cooperation as maintaining peace. If allowing one inmate an extra minute with another prevents a confrontation later, it's a trade many are willing to make. Others succumb to cynicism, aligning with specific groups to secure stability on their shift. In anthropological terms, this is the local treaty phenomenon. Within oppressive systems, informal alliances form between enforcers and subjects to maintain equilibrium. But every treaty comes at a cost. Each unrecorded favor deepens dependency between staff and gang networks, until the lines blur entirely. Inside the infirmary, nearly every act of care acquires an exchange value. Food portions, pain medication, mobility privileges, all become negotiable tokens. There exists, according to multiple former detainees, a secondary black market economy known as the ward trade. Inmates unable to afford commissary and general population use their time in the infirmary to accrue favors. Once discharged, they repay these debts through contraband smuggling or violent acts. What begins as recuperation evolves into economic indenture. It's an invisible debt system that mirrors the macroeconomy of incarceration itself. The institution profits from inmate labor. The gangs profit from inmate dependency. Perhaps the most psychologically effective recruitment method inside the NIC is protection through benevolence. Violence in the main jail complex is omnipresent. Fear lingers like humidity. Injured inmates transferred to the infirmary often arrive hypervigilant, flinching at footsteps, eyes darting for threat cues. A fellow patient who offers reassurance, shares commissary, or jokes about recovery can seem like a lifeline. This relationship develops quickly because it mimics care, something largely absent elsewhere in Rikers. Over days, the protector becomes mentor, then sponsor, then recruiter. The initiation isn't a beating, it's a promise. You won't have to go through that alone again. It's not coercion in the overt sense. It's emotional grooming, a pattern identical to cult initiation or coercive bonding. In psychological terms, this creates trauma dependency loops. Fear paired with intermittent relief produces loyalty. Information is the most valuable commodity in confinement. The infirmary's spatial separation from main housing units turns it into an intelligence relay. Messages flow through two principal channels. Medical paperwork, subtly altered notes, added initials, or highlighted times. Physical conveyance, staff, orderlies, or transferred patients who carry verbal or written codes. Some gangs employ what insiders call the pipe system, a literal tapping on the metal conduits between wards, echoing Morse-like codes across floors. Others rely on creative use of prescription labels or pill envelopes to send identifiers. The result is an encrypted communication web operating beneath bureaucratic oversight. Every shift change becomes a moment of transmission. Every handoff a potential signal. To observe the infirmary closely is to witness a psychological inversion, the transformation of medical ritual into social dominance. The doctor's round becomes an audience. The patient's compliance becomes submission. The sterile white of the sheets becomes the color of power. For the gang leadership, control over this environment conveys symbolic authority. If they can influence what happens even in the hospital, the one supposed sanctuary, it reaffirms their omnipresence. It is a strategy of psychological colonization. The institution's authority rests on the ability to define healing. The gang's counter-authority rests on the ability to appropriate healing. In effect, two medical systems operate in parallel. The official one which treats the body. The unofficial one which treats belonging. Both promise survival. Only one guarantees community. In 2018, an internal investigation logged as Incident 72 NIC revealed the anatomy of this system. A detainee hospitalized after a stabbing received multiple visits from other inmates posing as orderlies. He was overheard referencing repayment and family business. Within weeks of his discharge, he participated in a retaliatory assault in another facility. The investigators traced the recruitment chain back through hospital logs and discovered three key factors. Each visitor had legitimate medical duties. None of the staff reported unusual behavior. The inmate's psychological evaluation listed improved mood and sociability. Recruitment in this case manifested as recovery. The system had literally mistaken indoctrination for rehabilitation. Over decades, Rikers Infirmary has accumulated not just patients but traditions. Initiation stories passed through whispered lore. Nicknames etched into bed frames. Contraband stashes concealed behind vent panels dating back to the 1990s. Each layer of paint on those walls contains a stratum of institutional memory, each rule circumvented and repurposed. The space itself becomes a cultural document. Anthropologists refer to this as material continuity, the way physical environments preserve social patterns beyond policy cycles. Even if Rikers were shut down tomorrow, the NIC's logic would resurface elsewhere, because it's not built into the architecture. It's built into the habitus of captivity. Medical neutrality is one of the last ethical illusions sustaining the Rikers system. Administrators insist that the infirmary operates separately from penal logic. But that separation is theoretical, not operational. Every admission, every medication, every escort is mediated through the same power chain that governs punishment. Security protocols override clinical discretion. A patient's treatment plan is subject to classification clearance, not purely medical judgment. Thus, even doctors and nurses act as agents of carceral control, often unknowingly. Their records become data points in the broader intelligence matrix, tracking not just health but behavior, attitude, and loyalty. The infirmary is not apart from Rikers. It is Rikers distilled to its purest administrative form, the illusion of care as a mechanism of order. The central ethical paradox of the infirmary is simple yet devastating. Healing requires trust. Incarceration destroys it. Medical staff require patients to disclose pain honestly. Inmates learn to weaponize that honesty. To show vulnerability is to invite exploitation. To conceal it risks mistreatment. Thus, every interaction becomes performative. Patients fake symptoms to prolong safety. Others feign recovery to escape observation. Even truth becomes a strategy. The result is an ethical environment where sincerity cannot survive, a culture of necessary deceit. For nurses and officers alike, prolonged exposure to this environment produces psychological fatigue bordering on disassociation. Clinical studies on correctional medical staff show elevated rates of secondary traumatic stress and moral injury, conditions once reserved for combat medics. At Rikers, the repetition of small manipulations, the uncertainty of motives, and the erosion of empathy coalesce into numbness. One nurse, interviewed anonymously, described it as working in a play where everyone's lying, but no one can leave the stage. This chronic ambiguity erodes the professional identity meant to preserve objectivity. When everyone is both patient and predator, the act of care itself becomes corrosive. Following a 2022 internal review, the Department of Correction began experimenting with digital monitoring inside the NIC, AI-assisted camera analytics, microphone arrays, and real-time data dashboards. The intent was to detect unusual movement patterns, clustering behaviors, or contraband exchanges. However, data from the pilot program revealed an ironic twist. The AI flagged nurses more frequently than inmates, because caregiving inherently violates the behavioral norms of control. Touching, leaning close, lingering, all were read as anomalies. Technology, built to enforce order, failed to understand empathy. In the Rikers infirmary, even algorithms misinterpret humanity. Outside the island, city officials periodically cite the NIC as proof of reform. Press tours showcase gleaming equipment, clean corridors, and the language of care-based corrections. What the public doesn't see are the informal negotiations humming beneath that cleanliness, the whispered bargains, the invisible treaties. In anthropology, symbols often invert reality. The cleaner the appearance, the deeper the rot beneath. The Rikers infirmary is the perfect example, a space advertised as mercy, functioning as leverage. As night falls on the island, the ward quiets. The lights dim, the intercom hum fades, and the rhythm of the island slows. But in that quiet, the real communication begins. Coded knocks through the pipes, faint murmurs through vents, notes slipped into laundry carts. The ward's silence is never peace. It's choreography, the rhythm of survival disguised as recovery. From an anthropological lens, this nocturnal economy represents the full inversion of the hospital's purpose. The space meant to heal now sustains the same social pathology it was built to treat. By morning, the ward resets. Sheets are changed. Charts updated. Staff rotate. The performance begins again. Each day, the institution reenacts the same moral contradiction, the healing hand and the controlling gaze fused in one gesture. To study the infirmary at Rikers is not to study medicine, but to study ritualized hypocrisy, the kind of structural contradiction that defines entire civilizations. In this microcosm of concrete, medicine and violence have made peace, not by reconciling but by learning to coexist in perpetual tension. Every institution generates its own culture. Rikers Infirmary is no exception. Over decades, it has evolved from a place for healing into a culture about healing, a language of gestures and exchanges that simulate recovery while maintaining control. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz described culture as webs of significance men have spun for themselves. At Rikers, those webs are woven from pain. The scar becomes text, the wound a credential, the act of healing a rehearsal for dominance. Once this inversion is normalized, it does not end at the gate. Released inmates carry it outward. The notion that compassion is transactional, that help demands allegiance, that every benefactor hides an agenda. What began as a coping mechanism inside an island of steel spreads through the neighborhoods to which its residents return. Thus, the infirmary becomes an export industry of distrust. Inside the ward, both staff and detainees internalize the same pattern. Attempts at reform collapse into adaptation. Each generation of administrators imposes new procedures, segregated corridors, vetted orderlies, electronic logging, yet the subculture reemerges unchanged. This is the institutional form of learned helplessness. When every corrective effort is absorbed and repurposed by the system, those within stop believing change is possible. Doctors resign. Officers disengage. Even reform advocates speak in the fatalistic language of mitigation, not transformation. In this sense, the hospital ward's greatest contagion is resignation. Every scandal at Rikers produces a policy reflex. More surveillance, stricter classification, additional staff training. But each reflex tightens the loop of control that sustains the pathology. When violence appears, policymakers read it as a failure of discipline rather than of humanity. The response is more control, which reinforces the very environment that breeds coercion. The infirmary, once an outlier, becomes the model, a controlled space masquerading as compassionate. From an anthropological standpoint, this is cultural feedback. The moment an institution mistakes its symptom for its cure. The Rikers Infirmary exposes a larger fallacy in the architecture of modern incarceration, the belief that any space within a carceral system can remain neutral. Walls cannot neutralize culture. Ethics cannot annul power. Once the logic of punishment infuses an institution, every room, from courtroom to clinic, echoes its rhythm. In this sense, the infirmary story is less about Rikers than about America itself, a society that medicalizes its conscience while outsourcing its cruelty to bureaucracy. When detainees leave Rikers, many carry untreated trauma. Physical injuries heal, the psychic architecture of survival does not. Those who learn to navigate the infirmary's coded generosity replicated on the streets. Protection offered for loyalty, help granted for obedience. What the gangs taught inside a ward of steel reappears in informal economies of housing, drugs, and neighborhood politics. Anthropologically, this is cultural recursion, the prison as template for the outside world. The city becomes an echo of its own institutions. Every bruise, every scar produced in the infirmary tells a story the paperwork cannot. In medical anthropology, the body is the final archive, recording the transactions between power and personhood. A man who learns that pain grants access to care begins to reenact it subconsciously. Self-harm, feigned illness, and deliberate exposure to risk become strategies of communication. The body becomes both message and messenger. This is the deepest tragedy of Rikers, the human organism re-engineered to speak only through suffering. By their third year, many infirmary staff display symptoms that mirror their patients: hypervigilance, distrust, emotional blunting. Empathy becomes a liability, distance becomes survival. In the psychological literature, this convergence is known as institutional mirroring, the blending of oppressor and oppressed until both share the same adaptive behaviors. The nurse avoids eye contact, the inmate mimics professionalism. Both play roles in a script none of them authored but all of them perpetuate. Rikers' management structure changes faster than its culture. Each new commissioner inherits the language of reform but not the memory of failure. Policies cycle like tides. Lessons drown between administrations. In anthropology, this phenomenon is called structural amnesia, a deliberate forgetting that allows the system to appear dynamic while remaining unchanged. Every new directive to clean up the infirmary erases the context that makes such reform impossible. What survives is the mythology of effort, not the substance of change. For the anthropologist, there remains a moral dilemma. To observe is to participate. Fieldwork inside Rikers Hospital wing turns the observer into another layer of surveillance. The act of documentation risks replicating the control it seeks to critique. Hence, much of what happens in that ward remains undocumented, not out of secrecy but out of paralysis. No method exists for ethically describing a system that consumes empathy as fuel. This is why most official reports end in the same phrase: further study recommended. The study never arrives. Public hearings invoke the same keywords: safety, rehabilitation, trauma-informed care. But language here functions as anesthesia, dulling the nation's conscience without altering its behavior. The plan to close Rikers by 2027 promises smaller borough-based jails with modern medical units. Yet unless the underlying anthropology changes, the new wards will inherit the old ghosts. Architecture cannot outbuild ideology. The lesson of Rikers Hospital Ward is simple. You cannot heal people by reproducing the conditions that broke them. The pathology observed on Rikers Island is not local. Across the world, prison hospitals in Sao Paulo, Johannesburg, and Manila exhibit the same pattern. Care converted into currency, staff complicit through exhaustion, and violence disguised as order. The globalization of the supermax model has exported not just architecture but ethos. The belief that control equals security and security equals justice. Rikers merely perfected it on a municipal scale. Viewed anthropologically, the Rikers Infirmary is America's body in miniature. The diseased organ, systemic violence, racism, and poverty. The immune system, bureaucracy, policing, medicine, attacking the body it's meant to protect. The symptom management, policy reform instead of structural change. The ward's ceaseless cycle of wound treatment, infection, wound again is the national cycle of punishment. The patient and the state are the same organism, perpetually re-injuring itself to feel alive. Yet even here, small ruptures occur. A nurse who risks her job to report abuse, an orderly who quietly shields a patient from retaliation, a CO who smuggles books instead of blades. These brief insurgencies of conscience remind us that systems are not monoliths. They are made of people, each capable of deviation. Anthropologically, these acts represent counter-rituals, moments where compassion reclaims agency from structure. They do not reform the system, but they keep humanity from extinction within it. After decades of euphemism, the vocabulary of reform has exhausted itself. Words like rehabilitation, restorative, re-entry have become placeholders for unperformed empathy. Inside Rikers, language mirrors its architecture. Repetitive, sterile, echoing. The true dialect of the island is nonverbal. Glances, gestures, silences. It is through this language that gangs recruit, that staff negotiate, that survival communicates itself without speech. When words fail, culture speaks through behavior. Silence in the infirmary is not absence of sound but a structure of communication. At night, the stillness between cells is charged with coded meaning. A semiotic system born of suppression. Each unspoken truth adds weight to the collective quiet until it becomes its own language. For the anthropologist, documenting that silence is the final challenge. To hear meaning where the system insists there is none. The hospital ward's evolution into a recruitment hub has measurable legal consequences. Every assault that originates from its alliances prolongs sentences, feeds recidivism, and inflates the cost of incarceration. Each year, millions of taxpayer dollars are spent treating the results of violence generated inside a facility meant to prevent it. Justice becomes not a balance but a business cycle. Pain becomes self-financing. The phrase hospital discharge carries cruel irony. Inmates leave with antibiotics and paperwork but without freedom from the culture that awaits them back in general population. Many intentionally re-injure themselves to return to the ward, the only place where predictability exists. This compulsion parallels what psychologists call institutional dependence, a condition in which captivity feels safer than autonomy. The infirmary, meant to be a waypoint, becomes a home. Underlying every decision at Rikers is a philosophical assumption seldom spoken aloud. That control is the highest form of order, and order the highest form of justice. The infirmary demonstrates the bankruptcy of that idea. Here, control births chaos, order conceals decay. By medicalizing punishment, the institution has transformed moral failure into administrative routine. The question is no longer whether Rikers can be fixed, but whether the civilization that built it can imagine justice without domination. A night nurse walks the corridor at 3 a.m. Monitors blink green. A radio hums softly behind glass. She pauses by a patient's bed where the glow of a blood oxygen sensor paints the wall red. The patient sleeps. In the silence, she hears the faint tapping of pipes. A message traveling through the infrastructure, language of a world that will outlast both of them. She notes the vitals, signs the chart, and moves on. The island exhales. Rikers Hospital Ward began as an experiment in humane custody. It became the clearest window into the psychology of confinement. In its anatomy, we see the truth of every carceral system, that the state's power to punish eventually merges with its power to heal, until the two are indistinguishable. To study this place is to glimpse the frontier where medicine, morality, and control collapse into one. The real question is no longer how to fix it but what it reveals about us. When care becomes culture, cruelty no longer needs intention. It only needs routine.